Hi, my name is Matt McComas, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative and co-author with Matthew E Kahn of the new book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities. Today, I'm honored to be talking to Robert Embry, who's president of the Abell Foundation, and who's been leading the foundation's efforts to improve quality of life for people in Baltimore for over 3 decades. Mr. Embry was born and raised in Baltimore, and he has also served as president of the Board of School Commissioners for Baltimore City, Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development for Baltimore City. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Thanks. So in our book, Matt Kahn and I explore how the 6 post-industrial cities of Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis make investments in 4 key areas. Investing in education in the skills of both young people and older people, investing in businesses, investing in real estate and community development, and investing in public infrastructure and public goods. And today I wanted to focus our conversation in on 2 of those areas, investing in education and businesses. And so while I think the Abell Foundation is well known for its generous investments in education, workforce development, health, community development, criminal justice, environment, and the arts, what people and Baltimoreans might be less familiar with is how Abell Foundation is one of the largest and most focused local investors in Baltimore-based startup companies. And in my research and access to capital for small businesses in the city, this was something that came across very clearly. So could you tell me a bit about how the Abell Foundation's direct investment strategy works and why the Abell Foundation chooses to invest in local companies?
The foundations are 2 things. One, or do 2 primary things. One, they have a corpus, an asset base that they use to finance their charitable giving. And the charitable giving on average is about 5% of the asset base. So 95% of the foundation's money are invested usually with third-party money managers in the stock market and bond market and international funds and so forth. And all that is really like a casino in the sense that somebody is betting on your behalf that whatever they're investing in will become more valuable. And that's an informed decision to some degree, but in large part a gamble. And it doesn't benefit the city in any way, and it doesn't really benefit the corporation bondholder that you're investing in, because you're not giving the money to them directly. You're just buying their stock or bonds from somebody else in the market. And so we decided a number of years ago that while our 5%, which roughly today runs about $15 to $17 million a year, should be focused on the city and primarily on or not exclusively, but primarily on alleviating poverty and alleviating the disparity in assets between the minority and majority communities. That we should invest some portion of our assets in job creation, which Baltimore's main problem is caused by the unemployment and underemployment of its residents who don't produce enough money to support the taxes needed to support the community, and also impose an undue burden on the taxes of the city to finance their expenses caused by their poverty. And so we decided to invest a portion of our assets in startup companies, also because we were of the view, based on years of experience, that it was very unlikely that the city was going to attract any existing corporations of any size to the city, considering its high crime rate and its high taxes, which are incentives for people moving out of the city, that it would be very hard for Baltimore to attract existing corporations, although they may be able to attract startups, which in return for capital might choose to locate here because they didn't have a invested interest in any particular place because they didn't have a large number of employees. They're just getting started. So we invest about 20% of our assets, which is about $70 million in 40 or 50 startup over the years. And the startup has to either be in Baltimore or move to Baltimore. It has to be doing something that's socially worthwhile. I mean, we don't invest in dating apps, for instance, or new tennis shoes or something of that kind. And it has to be, in our estimation, something we're going to make money on. It has to be a prudent investment. We look for a 10x return or 10 times our investment return, which of course we don't realize in every instance, but we have exceeded that and actually have achieved more with our direct investments than we have with our traditional investments in terms of return. So in any event, that was our motive, and that's what we've been up to.
Wow, that's great to hear. And again, looking back into the early, mid, late 2000s, there was nobody in the city really of local financial institutions doing this level of local investing. But it seems there is a trend in, the past 3 to 5 years that more and more local financial institutions have started investing, making direct investments in local startups. So I don't know if you're seeing that same trend as well, and if Abell has been, a part of that movement.
Well, yes, I've seen the trend, and yes, as just I indicated, we're part of it because we've been doing it for a generation. A number of years ago, we went to the foundation assets in Baltimore are in excess of $7 billion. We're $350 million. So we're a small percentage of that. We're the largest local foundation focused exclusively on the city. But we're third in terms of asset size behind Weinberg and Casey, which are in the $3 billion range each, who are national or international in terms of their focus, although who do a wonderful and dramatic amount to invest in the city. But anyway, we went to the other foundations and said, look, we invest 20% of our assets in startups, and we're only, a small fish. Why don't you do the same? Well, their reaction was, well, we don't have the staff to evaluate startups. And so we helped create something called Propel, which was a fund at TEDCO, which is a statewide technology economic development corporation, to have them manage a fund and do the due diligence, of which any individual investor would only be a portion of the investment. So they wouldn't be 100%. And went back to them and said, look, if you invest in this fund, they'll focus on Baltimore City. And so not all, but some foundations and philanthropic individuals invested in that fund, and then they exhausted their original investment, and then the second fund was created. So that's an additional. Those are investments over and above the ones I referred to that are direct investments by the foundation.
Yeah, well, it's great to see that that trend in the city, and sure hope it continues as more and more people start to see and realize the success it's having. So next I wanted to...
Let me add one other thing. I don't know how much time you want to spend on this, but clearly startups are one possible route that the city can take. The other is existing companies, helping them expand. And CDFIs are a problem in Baltimore City compared to many other places. So there's been an ongoing, relatively recent effort to strengthen CDFIs. But in addition, there's an organization called Arcturus, which came to us and said that they thought a useful investment area was companies of, say, the up to 2.5 million, we'll say, of revenue that were in the city and that couldn't get traditional bank financing, although they had a good balance sheet, but for one reason or another couldn't get bank financing. And they would put up 80% of the money for these loans if we would put up, or somebody locally would put up 20%. So we did that along with the participation of the city's neighborhood investment fund that was created a couple of years ago. And so Arcturus is now out looking for businesses, and I think they just made their first 2 loans. And the loans are premised on a promise of the borrower that they will increase employment by some number, that if they get this loan, that'll permit them to expand and hire more people. So we'll see whether that's a fruitful route to follow.
Wow, that's we've been talking about setting something up like that in Baltimore City for quite a while. So eager to hear of the success.
Or failure.
Or failure, yes. Either way, it'll be good to know the answer to the question we've been posing for a while. So next, I wanted to move on to how Abell makes investments in education programs. And so in our book, Matt Kahn and I discuss the research of Nobel laureate economist James Heckman and his pioneering research on investments in early childhood education. And he has argued that children growing up in poor families and poor neighborhoods can benefit greatly from increased investment in their education and health at very early ages, and that achievement gaps that are present early on in school only become more difficult to close. So it's imperative to make investments early on. So I was wondering how the Abell Foundation has targeted its investments in innovative education programs in the city of Baltimore.
Well, of course, education is way beyond the Heckman focus on early childhood. And there are public interventions for a number of years after 3- and 4-year-olds. In fact, most of, obviously, the intervention just by age is in the subsequent years. And that gives a rise to the issue about what is possible. And your association with Johns Hopkins brings to mind the famous Coleman report of 1966-67, when the new federal Department of Education was created, and they asked James Coleman, who was the professor of sociology, and Peter Rossi, his associate, to answer the question, what caused positive educational outcomes, what were the major determinants of educational outcomes. And they came back with a common sense answer that you probably would get from the average person on the street, that the major determinant of educational outcome was the parents, their economic and educational levels, and particularly the mother. And that was the overwhelming determinant. That the second were the schools, and the second was who the child went to school with and who the child played with, or socialized with. And the children gradually, their level of inspiration and motivation gradually was vertical to begin with through their parents, where they took guidance from and instruction to a certain age, and then gradually it turned horizontal to looking to their peers for motivation and guidance. And so who you went to school with and who you associated with socially was a second major determinant. And then the third most important was the school. And the major determinant of the school was the teacher. So that gave rise to a half-century debate over what was possible in a public school system in a city where the overwhelming population was poor and concentrated in poor neighborhoods, going to school and associating with poor children. So that is one, I'll put that aside for a second as to how that might be addressed. But the third, the schools, which various studies have said the schools can affect outcomes 25%, 20%, 40, 30%. What can be done in schools to change that? And if you rank the schools by poverty in school systems, there's something called the NAEP study, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a study, a test you don't prepare for, which is given periodically nationally. And then there's a subset called TUDA, which is the urban systems that have agreed to participate in it. And Baltimore is one of those cities. And in that ranking, Baltimore City is at the bottom, along with Cleveland and Detroit, of educational outcomes. But then if you rank those cities by poverty, you find that the Baltimore is right where you expect it to be, along with Cleveland and Detroit, because they have the poorest student body. So given that Baltimore City faces this challenge of having the most challenging student body, what can be done to, if anything, to affect those outcomes? And obviously, since teachers were, in the Coleman study and many other indications, were a primary determinant, how do you impact the quality of teaching? And so we brought Teach for America here. I think we were the first city in the country after the original city to have Teach for America, in order to bring a talent pool to the city of the most successful college students who are going to the most competitive colleges and demonstrating the most successful outcomes, because the Baltimore City, like other distressed cities, had a difficult time recruiting teachers because their teaching conditions were tougher than suburban or small cities. So Teach for America has been here for, as I say, for over a generation, and then brought a Teach for America equivalent for principals here to try to widen the circle of recruitment for principals, which in the past were only hired from the Baltimore teacher talent pool and weren't recruiting nationally. And so that was additional, tried to affect the talent pool in the city. And we've involved with tutoring, which Bob Slavin at Johns Hopkins, who's one of the leading educational researchers in the country, he and his wife, Nancy Madden, concluded that the most effective intervention in improving students' reading and mathematics was tutoring. And so we have been funding and urging existence of and then expansion of tutoring in Baltimore City. School system agrees with this. It isn't a matter of trying to persuade them otherwise. I mean, the new superintendent, or relatively new now, Dr. Santelises, their problem has been resources. So, but also training and what model and evaluation to make sure your tutoring is effective. And then their whole range of other health and getting glasses to students. And I don't know whether you want to go through all of the programs in the school system we're involved with, but there are a number of others.
Yeah, well, I'd like to turn back to, you know, what you said about the importance of both concentrated poverty and you know, peer groups at schools and parents as well, and how Abell Foundation has addressed those sides of the equation.
Well, taking the second one, I mean, the first, the parents, let's get back to that in a second, but taking the second one, who you go to school with and who you socialize with, that relates to the increase in racial and economic segregation in many cities in the United States in recent years after a positive trend after the Brown decision and the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the Baltimore school system is now 90% minority and 80% plus poverty, so that the African-American children, it's largely an African-American issue in Baltimore, though there's some Latina and other migrant groups, but primarily it's African-American. When they went to school and when Brown was passed or decided in 1954, when the African-American population was segregated, the children went to school with the middle-class African-Americans who had the jobs that African-Americans were permitted access to. And so the norm in the community was a husband and wife employed father going to work in the morning. And with the change of fair housing laws and removal of the barriers of segregation, which of course are justified and long overdue, the middle class African American community moved out of those neighborhoods and in many instances out of the city. And the suburban areas of Baltimore that were described as the white noose by the Civil Rights Commission in the 1960s, the greatest increase in population in Baltimore County, for instance, was African American, which is about 5/7 of the population increase in the last decade in Baltimore County. So, question is, what do you do about that? So we went to the American Civil Liberties Union and suggested that they bring a lawsuit against the city and the federal government that modeled a Supreme Court case called the Gautreaux case in Chicago, where in Chicago, a similar suit had been brought against HUD and the local housing authority that they had segregated public housing in African-American neighborhoods, in effect reconcentrated the poor minority community in poor minority communities. And the result of the lawsuit, which was a complicated story in and of itself, but the end result was that Chicago was awarded, or the Chicago Housing Authority was awarded 4,500 what then were called Section 8 certificates, which had just passed Congress in 1975, which revolutionized public housing, which you didn't have to live in a project anymore to get subsidy. You could live wherever you wanted, oversimplifying, where you could find a landlord to rent to you. So the Thompson case was brought in Baltimore City, and almost 4,500 families with young children have moved out of the city into census tracts that are affluent, relatively affluent, and not minority concentrated. So those children now go to schools which are not concentrations of poverty, and that's a toe in the water. Then that's about 10,000 children. There are 80,000 children in the Baltimore City public school system, so it's not most of the children. But Baltimore City has 14, 15, 16,000 Section 8 certificates of its own, and they have used them almost 100% to rehouse low-income, overwhelming minority tenants in low-income minority areas. They've done almost nothing to address that issue. So that's a whole area of challenge, and reasonable people could disagree. Could say that helping somebody to move out is good for that family, but it's bad for the neighborhood. That it creates a vacant house and it reduces the population of the school, and it reduces the funding for the city school system because the city schools are funded on a per student basis. So a child that leaves means they get less state money, less federal money. So you can debate it, but there's no question for the family who wants to move and does the same thing that Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish American, other immigrant groups that have come to Baltimore and then gradually moved up and moved into more affluent suburban areas to permit these families to do the same thing. So, but worthy of a seminar discussion on the relative issues involved.
Yeah, there's certainly no easy answer to that. And to your point, I mean, colleague Stephanie DeLuca at Hopkins has done extensive research on the benefit that these children gain from being in more affluent neighborhoods. But you're certainly right that they're leaving a neighborhood that remains, and you can't move everybody out of a neighborhood.
Well, that, that doesn't say that you don't do what you can to improve where the 90% live. And that gets into an issue of what's possible, because there's a tension. The neighborhood has low rents. Poor neighborhoods have low rents because they're poor neighborhoods. There's high crime, there's high trash, there's segregated schools, there are vacant houses. So to the extent you improve the neighborhood, and let's leave aside what improve means, you're going to increase rents. You're going to make the neighborhood better. And therefore, rents will go up. Housing prices will go up, but homeowners who were captured, who couldn't sell their houses, or if they could sell them, it would be for much less than they paid for them, benefit because the value of their house goes up. And that gets related to property taxes going up. And then you have to which Baltimore has a circuit breaker tax to prevent that. But for tenants, the rents are going to go up. Their neighbor's going to get better, but rents are going to go up. And then there's the opposition to what's called gentrification, which generally is seen as white people moving into black neighborhoods. And the study that we financed on Baltimore showed that gentrification in Baltimore was overwhelmingly in white neighborhoods, where white working class neighborhoods in East Baltimore and Locust Point and Remington and Hamden and so forth were where this change was taking place of a more affluent group moving in. That it's not happening in African-American neighborhoods. So do representatives of the African-American community want that to happen, or do they not want it to happen? And again, this is the subject of a couple, a semester course.
Yeah, certainly, and constantly see those tensions play out as large real estate developments happen in poorer neighborhoods. There is that suspicion that gentrification might be coming. But as you said, that's a whole other topic of discussion. So I also wanted to touch on another aspect of education and investments that Abell makes, and this is in sort of the investing in the skills of middle-aged people and workforce development. And as economists think about it, as we age, it becomes more difficult for us to reinvent ourselves professionally and learn new skills. And labor economists and urban economists who have studied this have focused on two issues that middle-aged workers face. And the first issue is that some people are just out of the loop. They don't know about job opportunities in an area. And they also aren't aware of how to prepare themselves for those opportunities. And second, just the disconnect between where they live and places of work and where job opportunities are. So transportation opportunities, which as we know, are particularly bad in Baltimore. There's also a lot of conversation and research on middle-aged people and struggles with substance abuse and mental health as significant barriers to job seekers as well. So, I know Abell has invested in groups like Build's Turnaround Tuesday program, which is a morning group meeting of hundreds of job seekers talking about skill building and professional development and leadership development, and organizations like Bite Back, training adults in fundamental IT skills. But would like to hear more about sort of how Abell approaches the issue of workforce development and sort of reskilling or upskilling of middle-aged people.
Well, obviously, as you just indicated, you're talking about a whole range of people with different educational levels and motivation and criminal records and addiction problems and psychological or psychiatric problems and so forth. But just take a basic equation. There are jobs, there are employers that need people, and there are people that need jobs. And so what's the gap? Uh, Many, but one gap is that they're not the jobs that employers are looking for need a certain level of training that most people don't have. So we funded a study a year or two ago to talk to the job training programs in the city, about 30 of them, nonprofits, many of which we funded over the years, to ask them a couple of questions. One, were there more applicants for their training that were qualified, because we'll get back to that in a second, for the training, then they could train. And then were there more job openings for their trainees when they were finished training than they could fill? And if they had more resources, could they train more people? And we found 10 organizations that could train additional 2,000 people a year, roughly $5,000 a slot, or $10 million, that could do this. And so it's interesting that Baltimore City, and not uniquely to Baltimore City, has never funded job training. The job training has been funded by the federal government, and Baltimore City, of course, has more demands on its resources than it has resources to supply. Criminal justice, crime, housing, homelessness, so forth, so on, all could use more resources. But that is something we're trying to remedy either through the philanthropic community or government. Now you take, are they qualified for these job training programs? Well, most require a certain reading level, some require a math level. And the reading level is generally 8th grade, roughly, reading level. But it turns out that over half the Baltimore City public school graduates can't read at an 8th grade level. So that is another initiative that we're involved in to try to remedy that. But that's just, the recent recent public school graduates. But if that's true of them, you can imagine when you're out of school for 10, 15, 20 years, that whatever you had deteriorates unless you're reading and involved in keeping your skills or improving your skills. So that involves GED programs. How do you programs that get you a high school degree if you don't have one, which requires, among other things, reading remediation in order to pass that test. And are there enough programs for adults to get a high school degree, which is often required by an employer to have a high school degree? And that's a whole nother area that is under-resourced, and the level of adult illiteracy in Baltimore is staggering. Then on your mobility, each one of these, again, is a subject of more time than we have, but just take your point on the mobility. When the hurricane hit New Orleans a few years ago, and the low-income population was trying to get out of New Orleans, there was a study done about access to cars and urban populations and ranking cities by the lowest access to private transportation. And Baltimore City was the third worst. New York and Newark, which had elaborate mass transit systems, had fewer cars per 100 population, but Baltimore City was after that. And we funded something called Vehicles for Change for years, which supplies cars to low-income people, and the trains returning citizens from prison has a double benefit. And it's a great program, but it's a drop in the bucket in terms of addressing the problem. And people fault, as you did, the mass transit system in Baltimore. I don't know. It depends who you're comparing it with. But we had the same mass transit, or not even the same one, years ago when people working at Bethlehem Steel lived in West and East Baltimore and were able to get to work. And now we have the subway system going through West Baltimore and over to East Baltimore, and we have the light rail system, which we didn't have before, and obviously the bus system. So it could be better, no question about that. But whether it's certainly better than it was 30 years ago. And the problem is the jobs have moved. The transportation system is better than it was, but the jobs have decentralized and they're away from mass transit. So whatever mass transit system you have within reason, you're still going to have a dramatic gap between where the mass transit goes and where the jobs are. So that means that you got to help increase the jobs in the city, increase access to those jobs. It means you have to help people move to the suburbs, or you have to help people get private transportation, all of which we're involved with.
Yeah, great. So I don't want to take up too much of your time here, but it's been great learning more about some of the Abell Foundation's work, and look forward to learning more. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you for asking.